Sing Away the Silence. Written by Just Thinking Drabbles. Read by Arashi. Hubert was used to long, sleepless nights, and the ever-present ache which lingered in his bones afterwards. For many years in his service to Her Majesty, he had returned on nights just like this one, cold and rainy, his body numb with sleep as he trudged himself through the mud. It used to be that he enjoyed the quietness that came with his travels. It gave him time to clear his mind of unwanted thoughts and focus on prioritizing what tasks needed to be done upon his arrival. He had been content to make himself a cup of coffee to substitute for the rest he was avoiding and hide away in his office as he worked through the documents that had piled up in his absence. But now, the quiet served only to amplify the absence of his beloved husband, Ferdinand, and their daughter, Ira. The distance and time he spent away from them, though less and less in recent years, was agonizing to say the least. The desire to see them again spurred him forward as much as his exhaustion, if not more, and unlike in his youth, he had no intention of working when he returned home. No, seeing his family after a month away from the capital was all that he desired, and it filled him with an immense excitement. He felt himself smiling despite the awful downpour soaking through his clothes, and thought that maybe he'd grown soft in his days after the war. But he found strangely that didn't bother him. When their estate came into view, his heart leapt within his chest, and he fastened his pace. The steps leading to the entrance were long, and he took them two at a time in order to reach the sanctuary of their home as quickly as he could. He greeted the guards standing watch with a slight nod of his head as he entered through the double doors and took off his boots so that they wouldn't track mud across the carpet. The first thing he wanted to do was change out of his wet clothes before going to greet his family. Yet, just as he began towards their bedchambers on the second floor, he heard the sound of his husband's warm and inviting voice coming from the living room, followed by their daughter's infectious little giggle, one which sounded much like Ferdinand's. The fondness he felt was too great to ignore, and he found himself quietly making his way towards them. The first glimpse he caught was of Ferdinand's hair, which shone heavenly in the light of the fireplace, and Hubert immediately felt the urge to run his fingers through them. He leaned against the doorframe and watched his husband try to get Ira to stop jumping on the sofa. She was dressed in her pajamas, and her black hair was pleated and tied with a little red ribbon. It was not as good as when Hubert did it, but it was still decently neat. Yet, despite his best efforts, she did not seem inclined to lay down and rest at all. Her energy was as boundless as Ferdinand's, and it often took a great deal of effort to get her to go to sleep at a proper time. But, as with all things that Ferdinand did, he remained cheerful and patient, his smile wide even as his eyes were weighted with sleep. When Ira came by him again, he picked her up and began to tickle her, causing her to laugh once again. When it subsided, she settled into his arms with her head on his chest and rubbed her hands through her tired eyes. As she began to fall asleep, a song filled the peaceful quiet that had encompassed them, a familiar one from an old opera that even Hubert knew the words to by now. It was one of Ferdinand's favorites, and he sang it absently when doing just about anything, even during their years at the academy. He closed his eyes as he listened to the words and the way they sounded in his husband's lovely voice, and all the tension from the past month began to melt away from his body. He almost fell asleep himself, and only realized it when he felt his head beginning to lean forward. He was glad at least no one had seen him falling asleep in the doorway to the sound of his husband's voice. It's not like he could help it, though. The gentle lullaby filled him with a warmth that no fire could ever compare to. It made him feel safe and loved. Cherished, he might even say. That was something he never thought he could have, and the fact that he had a family to come home to still baffled him. A part of him thought that maybe it always would. When the song came to a finish, Hubert couldn't help but clap. "Very lovely," he complimented. The sudden announcement of his presence caused Ferdinand to jump and jostle their daughter awake. Their eyes met, and a beautiful blush blossomed across his cheeks. "Hubert," he replied breathlessly. "Daddy!" Ira shouted and jumped from his arms before running straight to Hubert. She wrapped her arms around his legs and squeezed them tightly. "I'm glad to see you too," he chuckled. "I'm so glad you're back, my love. But next time you might announce yourself instead of sulking in the doorway," said Ferdinand, and embraced him with just as much excitement as their daughter. When realizing that his clothes were soaking wet, however, he pulled away and took his hand in his. "Hubert, your clothes! You must be freezing. Come, sit by the fire so you don't catch a cold." "In a moment," he told him, and halted him as he intertwined their fingers. Ferdinand tilted his head, confused. "Might I at least kiss you hello first?" A dazzling grin filled Ferdinand's face as he nodded, and his cheeks flushed red once more. Ira's expression contorted with disgust. "Ew, Papa! Daddy! Don't kiss! It's gross!" They both chuckled fondly before Hubert lifted his cape to conceal them from her view. Ferdinand cupped his face in both hands and brought their lips together in a long and gentle kiss. It wasn't nearly enough, though, and they followed it after with several chaste pecks on the lip, cheeks, and even nose. Afterwards, Ferdinand brought their foreheads together and brushed his fingers through his husband's beautiful black tendrils. "Welcome home, my love."